I've been reading about the terrorist attack in Christchurch in Australia. And what's unique about this attack is the manifesto the guy left, which I've been reading through. He accepts that it's a terrorist attack, though by his definition, he's a partisan merely attacking occupying forces and therefore not guilty. He said if he would go to court, he would plead not guilty because he's merely protecting his nationalist ethno-nationality from Muslim invaders. Does he hate Muslims? He says no, he does not hate Muslims. He hates the fact that they're occupying his territory. He's really, this makes it a true act of evil. While he's not mentally ill, it seems he does have traces of paranoia, which we'll talk about shortly. This is not Las Vegas. This is not one of these terrorist attacks where we're scratching our heads what the motive is. His manifesto is not rambling. It is a little bit, disorientating to read, but there's a common theme here that holds throughout. He's asked if he's a conservative. He says no, conservatives are really just corporatists. He asked if he's a socialist. He said it depends who's in power under the socialist government. He asked that he wonders. He knows people are going to wonder if he's a Nazi. He says, "I'm not a Nazi. Nazis have never don't exist anymore. They haven't existed for 60 years." But he does constantly claim that he's a nationalist. That he thinks Trump's a bad leader, but he was a good figurehead for white identity, which is scary to think about. So he says under certain circumstances he would be a socialist, and under the current circumstances he's a nationalist. So we can see the makings of a real Nazi right here. And you can see the dangers the United States faces with people proclaiming nationalism is not an evil. It is. And socialism is not an evil. It is. The right wing flirts with nationalism, which is stupid. Patriotism, a love for your country is the way to go. Not an intellectual chauvinism about the country. That's idiotic. Everyone should know that. And it's dangerous. You don't even flirt with stuff like that. And the left is so god-awful insane about socialism right now that, 50-60% of the youth think that socialism is a good idea? It's insane. But again, he's not insane. He says he's not doing this for fame. He's not doing this for any other reason than he thinks the white race is under attack from birth rates. Muslims specifically come into the country as invaders, and because their birth rates are so much higher, they're going to commit this is white genocide, a slow motion genocide. It reminds me of something I heard about the Balkan Wars, and I forget who said it. It was a general who said, why aren't we attacking Milosevic? And he said it's a slow motion genocide. If Milosevic just kills a village a day, it keeps NATO away. And that sort of knowing Milosevic had when he was, killing people, to do it slowly. The killer here in Christchurch thinks that Muslims are taking that same approach. If we just do this very slowly, that will eventually outbreed them. And there are some imams in the Middle East and in Australia who have talked about such a thing, radical imams who say we will take over these lands simply by having more children. And then we can vote ourselves into power, and then we can make changes to the structure of the government. If you're a paranoid, there's always a little bit of truth running through paranoia. So if this guy's looking for Muslims who believe that, he can find them and convince himself that this is what's going to happen. There's a lot of inversion in here. For instance, when the U.S. started to bomb Serbia, when a Christian Milosevic was killing Muslims, when the U.S. intervened on behalf of Muslims and the West intervened on behalf of Muslims, he thought that was awful, that we should have been helping, or at least turning a blind eye or ignoring what Milosevic was doing because he was white and killing Muslims, that was okay. You see this constantly in evil people. They invert good and evil. They take the side of nefarious characters. He thinks he's a knight in this war, and he references people like Andrew Breivik and Dylan Roof, white supremacists who had killed black people and Muslims. Well, Breivik had actually killed Muslim apologists, a white Muslim apologist in Norway. So this is a fringe movement, but it's growing, and it's scary. The killer here looks up to nefarious. He's kind of like rappers and gangbangers who look up to drug dealers and drug kingpins. That's what we're dealing with this gentleman who committed this terrorist attack. Gentleman isn't the right word. This heinous demon who committed this terrible terrorist attack. He asks, though, does he hate Muslims? Jews? He says, no, I don't hate them. As long as they're in Israel or they're in their homelands. I don't hate anybody. Do you fear Muslims? Are you Islamic phobic? He says, no, I don't fear any Muslim. I don't want them in my lands. I don't want their birth rates here. They're too fertile, and white people are not fertile enough. They're not creating, not enough white people are being created. Therefore, we're going to disappear. He says that that he's probably fascist, but not conservative, like we mentioned. And he also he mocks violent video games. People are saying he was motivated by violent video games like Fortnite. He says, no, that's not the case. He's like, no, I'm doing this because I feel like I'm in a war. So that's that paranoid thing. He talks about there was the murder of a young girl in Europe or Australia. I can't remember. I think it was also in Europe. And he says that was the moment it changed him, when a Muslim man drove a truck through some crowded thoroughfare and mowed down a young girl who was walking home. He said, in that moment, I had to change. And in Paranoid, you do have that moment where everything shifts, where they see through the fog and everything becomes crystal clear and they know exactly what they're supposed to do. And if you talk to somebody who's paranoid, you can never shift that. There's nothing you could say to this man that would change his mind about the threat Islam places on the West. So he was going to do it. And just like Don Quixote, who knew there were dragons to go slay, he has to do this too. Don Quixote is sort of a lovable character. We always talk about that. But he was delusional and saw monsters where there were none. Now, it's not that Islamic terrorism isn't a real threat. Of course it is. Of course it's a real threat. But the idea that it's a pervasive, ubiquitous danger isn't true. So you have a guy here who is coherent, who isn't certifiably psychotic, but clearly suffers from paranoia in a lot of different ways. I talk about this often. Paranoids live in a pseudo-reality. It's called pseudologia fantastica. It's a world they create and they inhabit. And in his world, the West is under attack. And you can't get him out of this world. That's where he lives. So you can see that paranoid element in him. There's that delusional nucleus, that part of him that knows for certain there's a white genocide going on. There's a feeling that he's being surveillanced, that he's being watched, that there's an infection, an invasion. You can see this clearly in him. In Bin Laden, you saw it too, when the U.S. went to Saudi Arabia to help fight against Saddam when he took over Kuwait. Bin Laden saw women driving vehicles there and saw the American military bases there, temporary military bases, and he said the U.S. has come to establish Christianity here, a second religion. And Muhammad had said on his deathbed there should be no two religions in the Arabian Peninsula. So Bin Laden took this as a green light to kill Americans anywhere he could. That was the helping with Saudi Arabia and the U.S. teaming up to evacuate Saddam from Kuwait was the green light, the delusional nucleus in Bin Laden that allowed him to guilt-free, ruthlessly slaughter Americans and Westerners. That was his green light. And this guy has that same sort of moment where he sees it's okay, where his morality shifts, inverts, where he can slaughter innocent people. At one point in his manifesto, he's asking questions and answering them for himself. Do you think it's okay what you did, killing innocent people? And he says, I'm not killing innocent people. I'm killing invaders. And anyone who's invading and colonizing another deserves to be killed. So I would assume he doesn't feel the same when the West colonized other countries, that they don't deserve it, or maybe he does. It seems coherent, which makes it a rare type of terrorist attack. I'm only about a third of the way through. As I read more, maybe I'll add more to this, but I just wanted to give you my first thoughts on it. We see inversion, of good and evil. He worships evil people like Andrew Breivik and Dylan Roof. And he hates decent people. He also is nationalistic and possibly socialistic. And when you combine nationalism and socialism, you get Nazism. So we have the beginnings of Nazism here. And you have paranoia in a lot of different ways. We've touched on the delusional element of it. We've touched on the feeling of being watched, of living in your own reality, your own pseudologia fantastica. The nucleus that forms was the delusional nucleus, the seeing the girl getting mowed down, and then from that you create this world in which you exist almost by yourself, and you can't understand why other people don't see it. I'll just add one more point. During the French election, when Macron was elected, he thought that was ridiculous, that a nationalist had no chance and a globalist won. So you see all the elements that are here in the U.S. at play in this guy's psyche in a malignant, extremely toxic form. But the U.S. should not play with these elements. Oh, one more thing that's vital. The reason he used firearms and the reason he was very adamant about using firearms is because he thought it would create a conversation in the United States about firearms and further fraction and balkanize America. He looks at the left in a way as his ally because the left is so, they're racist. And he's a racist. He thinks everyone should be a racist. So he's almost giving credit to the leftists who are breaking society down by the lines of white, black, brown, yellow, etc. So that he thinks his act, while it won't make him famous, it'll start to further balkanize the West into racial factions. And then the whites can unite and push Hispanics and blacks and Asians out of their country. And of course, slaughter any liberals who are pushing diversity. He thinks he's pro-diversity. Because diversity, he thinks that if you combine all races, you lose diversity. His idea of diversity is keep Asians in Asia, keep Europeans in Europe and the US, keep Africans in Africa, keep Middle Easterners, Arabs, etc. in the Middle East, and then you have diversity by geographic boundaries where people are supposed to live. So he said, am I anti-diversity? I'm not anti-diversity. I'm pro-diversity. The people who want diversity in a single nation are just creating a melting pot, which he hates, and white people are going to get eaten up, devoured. So, despicable ideology, but it doesn't mean it's not coherent. There's a lot of things wrong with that, of course, because very briefly what's wrong with it is your skin color and the way you look has nothing to do with your gray matter. So, if you think, for instance, Muslims are coming into your country and aren't going to abide by, let's say, the rules of Western civilization. Let's say he believes that. What you do is you try to convince them of the power of, let's say, Western civilization. And it doesn't, the root of Western civilization is that individual, and he's anti-individualistic. He's actually anti-Western. He's a collectivist, which is not the Western ethos at all. There's cooperation. There's individuality with a cooperative undergirding, let's say. At any rate, he thinks he's Western. He's actually not. This is clearly anti-Western. It's the worst parts of Western society. It's when the U.S. it's when the Western world has gone off the tracks. World War I was the Western world going off the tracks, splitting into nationalism and, slaughtering each other. World War II was the Western world going off its tracks. It's not something that I would recommend anyone engage with in any way, shape, or form, even flirt with. But here in the U.S., we seem to think, what the hell, let's flirt with nationalism, let's flirt with socialism, let's flirt with various forms of collectivism. Despicable human being. I don't want to say his name. I just thought his manifesto was interesting in the sense that we finally have someone who didn't want any doubt as to why he did what he did. And it's not the psychotic ramblings that I've seen in other manifestos, like the Colorado movie theater shooter, the man who shot Gabrielle Giffords, was that her name, in Arizona. It's not Adam Lanza in Sandy Hook, this guy isn't psychotic. A bit paranoid, but not psychotic. Anyways, if I read more and find more interesting things here, and interesting again in a very demonic way, I'll make another video.